At 15, my father and stepmother drove me 800 miles to a remote cabin in the Appalachian Mountains just to hand me over to a stranger. But as that man counted the thick stacks of money, his eyes locked onto the silver locket resting against my collarbone. He suddenly froze. The color drained from his face as he dropped the cash, pulled a loaded gun on my father, and whispered, "What is your mother's name?" "My name is Vivica, and I am 32 years old. I survived that terrifying night in the woods, and today I am the one holding the gun, metaphorically speaking. Before I take you back to the exact moment I shattered my family's pristine facade into a million unfixable pieces, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe that the truth always comes to light no matter how deep toxic people try to bury it." The Piedmont Country Club in Atlanta was suffocating under the heavy weight of forced prestige. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over 200 of the city's most elite, powerful residents. It was a glittering sea of tailored tuxedos, custom silk gowns, and expensive perfumes that could not quite mask the underlying stench of hypocrisy. Tonight was the ultimate celebration of what my family liked to aggressively market to the public as Black excellence. My father, Ezekiel, was celebrating his 30th year as the founder of his real estate firm and his 10th year as the senior deacon of Atlanta's largest and wealthiest megachurch. He was a man who built his entire empire on the illusion of piety and unparalleled success. The mayor of Atlanta was sitting at the front table, chatting amicably with city councilmen. The senior pastor was laughing loudly over a plate of imported caviar, blessing the food paid for by congregation donations. Local celebrities, wealthy investors, and prominent community leaders were all there to pay their respects to the great and fallible Ezekiel and his flawless, untouchable family. I walked through the heavy mahogany double doors of the ballroom, wearing a custom emerald green gown that hugged my frame perfectly. The heavy silk swept against the marble floor with quiet, undeniable authority. For 17 long years, I was the absolute ghost of this family. I was the dark stain they had desperately tried to bleach away the unwanted child from a previous marriage. They pretended never existed so they could maintain their perfect narrative. But tonight I was not hiding in the shadows. I glided straight past the regular seating, ignoring the confused and judgmental glances from the church elders who faintly recognized my face. I walked with my head held high, my spine straight, and made my way directly to the center of the massive room, the VIP table. The table reserved exclusively for the upper echelon of Ezekiel's financial backers and his immediate perfect family. I pulled out a velvet-backed chair and sat down directly across from my father. The live jazz band was playing a smooth, rhythmic melody in the background. But the moment I took my seat, the atmosphere at the head table turned to absolute ice. My stepmother, Corinne, was in the middle of taking a delicate sip from her crystal flute. She wore a heavy diamond necklace that cost more than most people's homes, a physical manifestation of her holy superiority and unchecked greed. When her eyes landed on me, her fake camera-ready smile completely vanished. Her jaw locked so tightly, I thought her porcelain veneers might actually shatter. Before I could even reach for a linen napkin, Corinne lunged forward across the table. Her manicured fingers, complete with razor-sharp acrylics, clamped down on my bare arm like a vice. She jerked my arm so hard that the champagne in her glass splashed out, raining sticky sweet alcohol all over the emerald silk of my beautiful dress. She did not care about the mess or the scene she was creating. She leaned in close, her expensive floral perfume failing to mask the absolute venom in her breath. "Who let you in here?" she hissed, her voice a strained, furious whisper meant only for my ears. "This table is for donors who gave $10,000 to the church building fund. You do not belong in this room, let alone at this table. You are nothing but a low-level accountant making pennies. Go to the back and find the service entrance before you embarrass Kiara." Kiara was my 28-year-old half-sister, the undisputed golden child of the family. She was sitting 2 seats down, rubbing her slightly pregnant belly, wearing a maternity dress that was entirely too tight, dripping in diamonds that her husband had bought her. Kiara let out a small, dramatic scoff and turned her face away as if the mere sight of me was a personal insult to her high society sensibilities. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, and tonight she expected me to shrink away into the background, just like I did when we were helpless children. I did not flinch. I did not pull my arm away from Corinne's bruising grip. I simply picked up a crisp white linen napkin from the table and slowly, methodically wiped the spilled champagne from my dress. My absolute calmness seemed to infuriate her even more. She was used to me cowering. She was used to the scared 15-year-old girl who used to beg for her approval and love. That girl was long dead. I looked up, bypassing Corinne entirely, and locked my gaze on my father. Ezekiel sat perfectly still, his large hands resting flat on the tablecloth, trying desperately to maintain his dignified, holy aura. But I could see the sweat forming at his temples. His breathing had become shallow and rapid. He knew exactly why I was here. "Embarrass, Kiara?" I asked, keeping my voice steady, melodious, and beautifully clear. It carried just enough volume to make the neighboring VIP tables quiet down. The clinking of silverware slowed to a halt. Conversations suspended in midair. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, holding my father's terrified gaze. "Is my presence really the most embarrassing thing this family has ever done, Dad? Because I can think of something much worse." Corinne tightened her grip on my arm, her nails digging painfully into my skin. "Vivica, shut your mouth right now," she commanded, trying to keep her voice low. But the sheer panic in her eyes was palpable. She glanced frantically toward the pastor's table, terrified that her righteous facade was slipping. I gently but firmly peeled Corinne's fingers off my arm, dropping her hand back onto the table as if I had just touched something foul and diseased. "What about the night you and Corinne dragged me out of my bed?" I said, my voice cutting through the ambient jazz music like a newly sharpened blade. "What about the night you tied my hands with industrial zip ties, threw me into the trunk of your luxury sedan, and drove 800 miles north into the darkest, most isolated parts of the Appalachian Mountains? You told everyone at church the next Sunday that I had run away. You stood at the pulpit, wept fake tears, and asked the massive congregation to pray for your wayward, troubled teenage daughter. But we both know that was a calculated, filthy lie." Ezekiel's chest heaved. He looked around frantically. The mayor was now looking directly at our table, a deep frown creasing his forehead. The senior pastor had completely lowered his fork, his eyes wide with shock. The pristine, impenetrable bubble of their high society life was cracking wide open for the entire city to witness. "You handed me over to a stranger." I continued enunciating every single syllable so that the surrounding tables could hear exactly what kind of man their beloved deacon truly was. "A stranger waiting in a decaying hunting cabin in the middle of nowhere. You handed me over in exchange for a duffel bag containing $50,000 in unmarked cash. You needed to cover the money you stole from the church building fund, didn't you, Dad? 50 grand for your own flesh and blood. You sold your 15-year-old daughter to a man you thought was a criminal just to save your own reputation." Corinne gasped dramatically, bringing a hand to her chest, trying to play the horrified, victimized mother. Ezekiel finally found his voice, though it shook uncontrollably, lacking all the booming authority he used during his Sunday sermons. "You are insane." Ezekiel sputtered, his face turning an unhealthy shade of ashen gray. "You have always been mentally unstable, Vivica. You are having a psychotic episode. Security. Someone call security right now. She is completely delusional." I laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound that echoed in the tense silence of the ballroom. I reached up to my neck and grabbed the heavy silver locket resting against my skin. I unclasped it and tossed it onto the table. The heavy metal hit the glass centerpiece with a loud, resounding crack, shattering the crystal edge. "You remember this locket, don't you?" I asked, leaning closer until I could see the absolute terror in my father's eyes. "You were halfway to your car with your blood money. You were ready to drive back to Atlanta and play the grieving father. But do you remember what happened when the man you sold me to finally looked at me in the dim light of that cabin? He saw this locket. He recognized the unique engraving on the front. He froze completely. And then he dropped your dirty money on the floorboards, pulled a .45 caliber pistol from his waistband, and aimed it right between your eyes." Ezekiel swallowed hard. He was physically shrinking in his chair, the facade of the powerful real estate mogul dissolving into the pathetic, cowardly man he truly was. "He asked you a question, Dad." I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper that somehow felt louder than a scream. He cocked the gun and asked, "What is your mother's name?" "And what did you do?" "You ran. You pushed Corinne out of the way, sprinted to your car, and left your teenage daughter in a cabin with an armed stranger. You drove off into the night and never looked back. Should we tell the pastor who that man actually was? Should we explain to your wealthy investors exactly why you have spent the last 17 years pretending I was dead?" The silence in the room was deafening. No one moved. No one spoke. The sheer gravity of my words hung over the VIP section like a heavy storm cloud ready to burst. The elite guests were paralyzed, watching the pillar of their community be exposed as an absolute monster. Suddenly, a loud, violent slam shattered the quiet. Preston, my 35-year-old brother-in-law, slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the silverware and knocking over a water glass. Preston was Kiara's husband. He was a wealthy white investment broker who wore his privilege like a weapon. He used his Wall Street persona to constantly belittle the black people around him, disguising his deeply ingrained racism behind a mask of corporate superiority. He was the golden son-in-law, the man who supposedly elevated the family's status to new, unreachable heights. Preston stood up, towering over the table, his face flushed red with arrogant indignation. He pointed a finger directly at my face. "Listen here, you ghetto trash!" Preston sneered, his voice booming across the room, ensuring everyone could hear his attempt to put me in my place. "I do not know what kind of pathetic lies you are spinning to get attention, but you are leaving, right now. You come in here with your cheap theatrics trying to ruin a night that I paid for. My firm manages this country club's assets. You do not belong in this zip code. You are nothing but a disgruntled low-class failure trying to extort money from successful people." He turned to the surrounding tables, flashing a slick, practiced smile. "I apologize for this disruption, ladies and gentlemen. My wife's estranged sister clearly has some severe substance abuse issues. Security will be escorting her out immediately. Please enjoy your evening." He looked back at me, his eyes full of malicious contempt. "Get up and walk out that door before I have you arrested for trespassing," he demanded. "At your level of income, you cannot afford the legal fees I will bury you with. Now move." I looked at Preston. I looked at his expensive, tailored suit. I looked at the smug, untouchable expression on his face. He thought he was dealing with a helpless poor relative who could be bullied into submission. He had absolutely no idea who I had become in the 17 years since my father left me in those woods. He did not know about the stranger in the cabin, and he certainly did not know about the massive arsenal of financial information I was currently holding in the palm of my hand. I slowly picked up my glass of water. I took a calm, deliberate sip. I let the extreme tension stretch for a few agonizing seconds while Preston waited for me to obey his command. Then I set the glass down and smiled. It was the kind of smile an apex predator gives right before it strikes its prey. "Preston," I said softly, "are you absolutely certain you want to play this game with me tonight? Because if I walk out that door, I am taking your entire financial empire with me." The silence in the room stretched until it felt like a physical weight pressing down on everyone present. Preston let out a laugh. It was loud and booming and completely devoid of any real humor. It was the laugh of a man who was desperately trying to regain control of a room that was slipping through his fingers. He adjusted the cuffs of his bespoke suit, a suit paid for by the very people he was currently manipulating, and took a step closer to my chair. He wanted to loom over me. He wanted to use his physical size to intimidate me, a tactic he had undoubtedly used 1,000 times before in boardrooms and golf course negotiations. But I was not one of his subordinate junior analysts, and I was certainly not his subservient wife. He leaned his hands on the table, invading my personal space, bringing the scent of his expensive scotch and overpowering cologne right to my face. "My financial empire." He repeated, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "That is rich coming from you. Let us get a few things straight right now, Vivica. You are a high school dropout who vanished into thin air because you could not handle the pressure of living in a respectable household. You have no education, no pedigree, and absolutely no standing in this room. Do you know who I am? Do you have any idea the kind of power I hold in this city? I kept my eyes locked on his, my expression utterly blank. Tell me, Preston, I said softly. He smirked, thinking he had finally cracked my armor. I am the man who manages the assets for this entire country club, he boasted, gesturing to the lavish ballroom around us. I sit on the board of directors. I advise the mayor on urban development. I single-handedly took your father's modest real estate firm and turned it into a multi-million-dollar enterprise. I paid for this entire gala tonight out of my own pocket just to honor Ezekiel. I am the reason this family has a seat at the table with the true elite. You do not belong in this zip code, let alone at this table. You are nothing but a ghost from a past this family has worked very hard to overcome. He snapped his fingers in the air, a sharp, disrespectful sound directed at the two security guards who had been hovering nervously near the ballroom entrance. Gentlemen, I want this woman escorted off the premises immediately, he ordered. If she resists, call the police and have her arrested for trespassing and public disturbance. I will personally make sure the charges stick. The guards exchanged an uncertain look. They recognized Preston, of course. He made sure everyone in the service industry knew exactly who he was and how much power he wielded over their employment. But they also saw me sitting completely unbothered at the head table, dressed in a gown that cost more than their annual salary, speaking to the guest of honor with terrifying familiarity. They hesitated, shifting their weight from foot to foot, unsure of how to proceed. Preston's face flushed a deeper shade of crimson at their hesitation. "Are you deaf?" He barked, his polite society mask slipping to reveal the raw, entitled anger underneath. "I said get her out of here." I did not even look at the guards. I slowly unclasped my evening clutch. The soft click of the metal fastener sounded incredibly loud in the hushed room. Preston's eyes darted to my hands, a brief flash of genuine uncertainty crossing his features. He expected me to pull out a weapon, or perhaps a tear-stained letter. Instead, I withdrew a sleek, ultra-thin tablet. I tapped the screen once the cool blue light illuminating my face in the dim ballroom. "You talk a lot about your firm, Preston," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly over the low murmur of the shocked guests. "You brag about managing assets and elevating my father's business. But which firm are we actually talking about tonight? Are we talking about the legitimate front-facing brokerage you display on your glossy website? Or are we talking about the shell company registered in the Cayman Islands?" Preston froze. The arrogant smirk vanished from his face so quickly, it was as if it had been wiped away by a physical blow. "What did you just say?" he demanded, his voice suddenly lacking its previous volume. I tapped the screen again and began reading from the brightly lit display. "Let us look at the numbers, shall we? According to these routing details, your primary holdings account has been bleeding capital for the last 36 months. You made a series of catastrophic bets on commercial real estate right before the market shifted. To cover those massive losses, you set up a dummy corporation." I looked up, meeting his terrified gaze. "You used this shell company to launder my father's church donations. The tithes, the offering plates, the generous checks written by the elderly congregants sitting in this very room. Ezekiel funneled millions of dollars of untaxed church revenue directly into your failing hedge fund under the guise of charitable investments. And despite injecting all that stolen holy money into your accounts, you are currently defaulting on a $12 million loan from a private equity firm that is very well known for not taking kindly to missed payments." A collective gasp rippled through the VIP section. The senior pastor, who had been sitting frozen in his chair, dropped his heavy silver fork onto his china plate with a loud clatter. His face had gone completely white. He turned slowly to look at my father, who was now clutching his chest, breathing in rapid, shallow gasps, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. "Ezekiel," the pastor whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of shock and dawning fury. "Ezekiel, tell me she is lying. Tell me right now that you have not been touching the sanctuary funds." My father could not speak. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic wheezing sound came out. He looked at Preston with wild, pleading eyes, begging his golden son-in-law to fix the catastrophic disaster unfolding before them. But Preston was too busy staring at the tablet in my hand, his mind desperately trying to calculate how a supposed high school dropout had gained access to his highly encrypted, heavily guarded financial secrets. "That is a complete fabrication," Preston finally managed to say, though his voice cracked on the last word. "You forged those documents. You hacked into my public servers and doctored the numbers to make it look like a scandal. This is corporate espionage and defamation of character." I smiled, a slow, deliberate curving of my lips. "Defamation requires the statements to be false, Preston." The routing numbers on this screen matched the exact transfers made every Monday morning for the last 2 years. Every time Ezekiel stood at the pulpit and preached about giving to the Lord, he was actually preaching about giving to your offshore accounts. "You are drowning in debt. Your firm is a house of cards waiting for a strong breeze, and you have dragged my father's entire religious empire down into the mud with you." Preston's breathing became ragged. He looked around the room, seeing the expressions of the wealthy donors morph from confusion to profound suspicion. These were powerful people. They did not take kindly to being defrauded, and they certainly did not tolerate being made to look like fools by a slick-talking broker who married into a megachurch family just to access their wallets. He needed to regain control immediately. He needed to re-establish his dominance and crush my credibility before the seed of doubt could take root in the minds of his investors. He let out another laugh, forcing it to sound dismissive and thoroughly unbothered. He looked over his shoulder and caught the eye of two men sitting at an adjacent table. They were wearing identical charcoal suits and had the distinct predatory look of high-priced defense attorneys. Preston gave them a subtle nod, signaling them to prepare for a fight. They immediately reached for their briefcases, their eyes locked on me. "You think a fake spreadsheet scares me?" Preston asked, turning his attention back to me. His voice was gaining strength again, fueled by his desperate need to maintain his illusion of supremacy. "You think you can waltz in here after 17 years, wave a piece of plastic around, and bring down a man like me? I have the best legal team in the state sitting right behind me. They will tie you up in civil litigation for the rest of your miserable life. You will be paying my legal fees until you are in the grave." He stepped back from the table and threw his arms wide, encompassing the grandeur of the ballroom. "I am Preston Vance. I do not default on loans. I do not need to steal from a church." He turned to his wife, who had been watching the exchange with wide, terrified eyes. Kiara was clutching her pregnant stomach, her heavy diamond bracelets clinking together as she trembled. Kiara Preston said, his tone shifting into a sick, twisted imitation of a loving, proud husband. "Tell your sister about our latest purchase. Tell this jealous, bitter woman exactly how poorly we are doing financially. Tell her about the house we just closed on." Kiara blinked, startled by being pulled into the crossfire. She looked at Preston, then at me, her lifelong habit of seeking validation from her husband, battling with the sudden sinking fear that everything I had just said might actually be true. But the conditioning was too deep. She had spent her entire life believing she was superior to me, and Preston was the ultimate symbol of that superiority. She raised her chin, channeling her mother's haughty arrogance, and forced a proud, condescending smile onto her face. "We just bought a mansion in Buckhead," Kiara announced, her voice ringing out clearly. "It is a 10,000-square-foot estate in the most exclusive gated community in Atlanta. And we did not even need a mortgage. We bought it for $4 million. In cash." Preston beamed, looking around the room as if waiting for a round of applause. He turned back to me, crossing his arms over his chest, his posture screaming victory. "You hear that, Vivica? $4 million in liquid cash. Does that sound like a man who is defaulting on his loans? Does that sound like a firm that is bleeding capital? You made a massive miscalculation coming here tonight. You thought you could play in the big leagues, but you are completely out of your depth. You are nothing but a pathetic liar trying to ruin her family out of spite." I sat perfectly still, letting his triumphant words echo through the silent ballroom. I looked at Preston, basking in his own manufactured glory, and then I looked at Kiara, who was desperately clinging to the illusion of her perfect, untouchable life. They were so incredibly confident in their lies. They truly believed that their wealth and their status made them invincible. I slowly locked the screen of my tablet and placed it gently on the table next to the shattered crystal centerpiece. I did not raise my voice. I did not show an ounce of the rage that was coursing through my veins. I simply let the silence stretch, waiting for the perfect moment to pull the rug out from under their $4 million fairy tale. Preston thought he had won. He thought he had successfully painted me as a jealous, deranged outsider. But he had no idea that I was holding the deed to his destruction. Preston's face flushed a deep, mottled purple. He opened his mouth to shout another threat to call my bluff, but before he could emit a single sound, a soft, deliberate sobbing echoed from his right. Kiera had decided it was her time to take the stage. My younger half-sister pushed her chair back. The heavy legs scraped against the marble floor as she stood up. She placed one hand protectively over her slightly rounded pregnant belly, ensuring that every eye in the ballroom gravitated toward her maternal state. Her other hand fluttered to her chest. Her fingers rested lightly against a diamond necklace that caught the light of the chandeliers. She looked like the ultimate picture of tragic grace, a perfect affluent mother-to-be whose special night was being ruined by a volatile relative. "Vivica, why are you doing this?" Kiera cried out. Her voice trembled with perfectly manufactured sorrow. Her tears were thick and fast, ruining absolutely nothing of her flawless makeup. She stepped around Preston, placing herself between her husband and me. She was playing the role of the fierce but gentle defender. "Why are you so bitter, Vivica? Why can you not just be happy for us for once in your life? Mom and Dad gave you everything. They gave you their home, their name, their love. They tried to save you from yourself, but you chose the streets. You chose to be a rebellious, broken girl who could not appreciate the blessings of a good family." I watched her perform. It was a masterclass in manipulation, honed by years of watching our stepmother Corinne do the exact same thing. The guests at the surrounding tables murmured in sympathy. A few of the older church ladies shook their heads, whispering about how tragic it was for Kiera to deal with such a disturbed sister during her pregnancy. Kiera wiped a tear from her cheek. Her diamond tennis bracelet flashed brightly in the golden light. She took a deep breath, puffing out her chest as she prepared to deliver her ultimate self-righteous speech. "We are sitting here tonight celebrating Black excellence," she continued. Her voice rose to reach the back of the massive room. "We are celebrating the incredible legacy that our father built from the ground up through faith and hard work. Preston and I are honoring that legacy every single day. We are not just buying $4 million mansions in Buckhead. We are building the community. Tomorrow morning, Preston and I are closing on a state-of-the-art pediatric clinic right here in Atlanta. We are bringing elite healthcare to children who need it. We are building generational wealth and a positive future for our own child." She took a step closer to my side of the table, looking down at me with an expression of profound, sickening pity. "And what are you doing, Vivica? You burst in here wearing a dress you probably rented, spewing wild, psychotic lies about kidnapping and embezzlement because you cannot stand to see us thrive. Stop being so jealous. Stop trying to drag us down into the gutter just because you could not figure out how to make something of your own life. It is pathetic, Vivica. It is just sad." The ballroom was dead silent. The wealthy guests were completely captivated by Kiera's emotional monologue. Preston placed a supportive hand on his wife's shoulder, nodding solemnly as he played the role of the steadfast rock. Corinne let out a loud theatrical sniffle, dabbing at her eyes with a linen napkin. They had woven their web of lies so tightly that they actually believed their own narrative. They truly believed that if they just spoke loudly enough and used enough buzzwords like legacy and community, the truth would simply evaporate into thin air. I did not raise my voice. I did not match her hysterical energy. I simply tapped the screen of my tablet 3 times. When I had arrived at the country club earlier that evening, I had not just walked through the front doors. I had taken a brief detour to the audio-visual control room near the service entrance. It had taken me exactly 4 minutes to bypass their outdated security firewall and sync my tablet directly to the ballroom projector system. It was the exact same system currently displaying a looping slideshow of Ezekiel's glorious real estate achievements on 2 50-foot screens behind the head table. With my third tap, the slideshow abruptly vanished. The screens flickered, turning a stark, glaring white. that cast a harsh, unflattering light over the entire VIP section. Then a high-resolution unredacted legal document appeared on both massive screens, magnified so large that even the guests at the very back of the ballroom could read the fine print without needing their reading glasses. A collective gasp rolled through the crowd. The quiet background music from the jazz band faltered and completely stopped as the musicians turned around to look at the display. "A $4 million mansion?" Kiera Y asked. My voice sliced cleanly through the shock in the room. "You mean the estate on West Paces Ferry Road? The one you have been posting on your social media all month with the hashtags blessed and wealthy?" Kiera froze. Her hand dropped slowly from her belly. She turned to look at the massive screens behind us. "Let us read the top of this document together," I suggested, remaining comfortably seated in my velvet chair. "Notice of foreclosure and public auction. And if you look closely at the grantee name listed on the original deed, you will not see your name, Kiera. You will not even see Preston's name. The deed is entirely in the name of Martha Vance, Preston's mother." Kiera's jaw went slack. She blinked rapidly. Her eyes darted across the 50-foot projection reading the undeniable legal terminology. She shook her head violently. Confusion warred with rising panic. "No," she stammered, taking a step back. "No, that is a mistake. Preston paid cash for that house. He put my name on the paperwork. I saw the paperwork with my own eyes." I swiped my finger across my tablet and the massive screens instantly transitioned to an entirely new set of documents. These were wire transfer receipts, complete with routing numbers, dates, and international bank stamps. "He showed you dummy paperwork, Kiera," I explained. My tone was almost conversational, as if I were explaining a simple math problem to a slow child. "He never paid cash for that house. He took out a massive predatory loan using the property as collateral. But that is not even the best part. Tell the crowd about this wonderful pediatric clinic you are supposedly opening tomorrow. The one that represents your great contribution to the community and your beautiful legacy." I swiped my screen again. The projection shifted to a series of aggressive withdrawal statements from a joint business account labeled Vance Pediatric Holdings. The numbers glowed in bright red ink for everyone to see. "The money for the clinic is gone," I stated clearly. "All $2.5 million of it. Preston completely drained the clinic operational accounts over the last 48 hours. But do not worry, he did not just lose it in the couch cushions. If you look at the recipient accounts on the screen, you will see exactly where your community legacy went." I pointed toward the giant screen. "The Grand Lisboa Casino in Macau. Your husband has been running a massive underground gambling debt for the better part of a year. The people he owes money to do not send polite collection letters, Kiera. They send men who break kneecaps in dark alleys. Preston wired the entire clinic fund to Macau yesterday afternoon just to keep himself breathing, which is exactly why your beautiful Buckhead mansion is going up for public auction on Tuesday. You do not own a home. You do not own a clinic. You do not own anything at all." The silence in the room shifted from shocked to absolutely suffocating. The guests were staring at the screens, reading the undeniable proof of Preston's complete financial ruin. The mayor of Atlanta was whispering furiously to his security aide, looking completely horrified. The wealthy donors at the adjacent tables were looking at Preston as if he carried a highly contagious disease. Kiera turned completely pale. All the color drained from her perfectly contoured face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. The haughty, superior aura she had worn just seconds ago dissolved into pure, unadulterated horror. She looked at the screen, and then she turned her head slowly to look at her husband. "Preston," she whispered. Her voice trembled so violently she could barely form the word. "Preston, tell me this is a trick. Tell me she hacked something and made this up. Tell me where the clinic money is right now." Preston was sweating profusely. His expensive cologne was suddenly overpowered by the sour stench of raw panic. He took a step backward, his eyes darting toward the exit doors. "Kiera, listen to me," he stammered, raising his hands defensively. "It is just a temporary liquidity issue. It is a bridge loan. I was going to move the funds back before closing tomorrow. I just needed a few days to clear a margin call. She is taking this entirely out of context. A bridge loan to a casino in Macau. I interrupted, laughing softly. Do they teach that kind of financial strategy at your elite business school, Preston? Kiara let out a sound that was half sob and half scream. She shoved Preston backward. Her perfectly manicured hands hit his chest hard enough to make him stumble. You lied to me! She shrieked, no longer caring about the audience or her carefully maintained high society image. You told me the house was in my name. You told me the clinic was funded. We have a baby coming. Where is my money, you liar? Preston stumbled, trying to grab her hands to quiet her down. Keep your voice down, Kiara. You are embarrassing us in front of the clients. I will fix it. I just need a minute to make some calls. Do not make a scene. There is no fixing this, I said, leaning back in my chair. You are bankrupt, Preston. You are entirely liquid. And the worst part is the money you gambled away was not even yours. It was the seed money my father illegally siphoned from the church to keep your firm afloat. At the mention of the church money, Ezekiel finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. He realized that if I kept pulling up documents on those massive screens, his entire congregation, his wealthy backers, and the city officials present would see the exact mechanism of his fraud. The illusion of his wholly untouchable empire was seconds away from completely imploding right in front of the people who funded his lavish lifestyle. He could not let me speak another word. He had to change the narrative immediately, and he had to do it using the only weapon he had left. Religion. Ezekiel lunged past Corinne, knocking his heavy wooden chair to the floor with a loud crash. He bolted toward the small podium set up at the edge of the stage, where the microphone for the evening speeches was positioned. He grabbed the microphone with both hands. His knuckles turned white as he gripped it desperately. He did not speak to me. He did not address Preston's gambling, or the foreclosure notice still glaring brightly on the 50-foot screens. Instead, he turned his frantic, sweat-drenched face toward the center of the ballroom, looking directly at the senior pastor. Pastor Miller Ezekiel bellowed into the microphone, his voice amplified to a deafening volume that startled the entire room and echoed off the high ceilings. Pastor Miller, I need you to stand up right now. I need the elders of the church to come forward this instant. The senior pastor, a tall, imposing man who had built his own fortune entirely on the blind faith of his congregation, stood up slowly, looking incredibly uneasy. He clutched his napkin, staring at my father as if he were looking at a madman. Ezekiel pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at me. "Look at her!" he yelled. His voice vibrated with manufactured religious fervor and desperate panic. "Look at the darkness in her eyes. This is not my daughter speaking. This is the devil trying to infiltrate our holy gathering tonight. She has been corrupted by the streets. She is filled with a spirit of jealousy and destruction sent by the enemy to tear down the righteous work we have done for this community. She is using fabricated technology and wicked lies to sow division in my family." He gripped the podium, closing his eyes tightly, performing for his life. "We must cast this evil out," Ezekiel shouted. Sweat rolled down his forehead in thick drops. "Pastor, I am begging you, bring the anointing oil. Bring the elders. We must pray over this broken, demonic girl before she poisons this entire room with her spiritual sickness. She needs an intervention of the Holy Spirit, and she needs to be removed from this consecrated celebration immediately." Ezekiel stepped away from the podium and began marching toward my table. His arms were raised high above his head in a gesture of ultimate surrender to a higher power, but his eyes were completely devoid of anything holy. They were the eyes of a cornered animal. Pastor Miller, flanked by 3 senior deacons, hurried across the ballroom floor. The jazz band had completely stopped playing, and the heavy silence was now filled only with the sound of my father speaking in tongues. He was putting on the performance of a lifetime, using the very religion he had corrupted to silence the truth. He reached my table and slammed his heavy hands onto the white linen right next to my shattered plate. He closed his eyes tight and began to shout, commanding the evil spirits to release his daughter. He told the entire ballroom that I had been suffering from severe mental illness since I was a teenager. He claimed my mind was broken and that I was prone to terrifying delusions. I sat perfectly still as his spit flew across the table. He begged the Lord to forgive me for trying to extort the house of God. He told the mayor and the city councilman sitting just a few feet away that I had forged those digital documents because I was desperate for cash and bitter that I had not been included in the family inheritance. The congregation members who had filled the surrounding tables began to murmur in agreement. This was the narrative they needed. It was much easier for them to believe that a stray, estranged daughter was simply having a violent psychotic break than to accept that their esteemed deacon had stolen their tithes. I could hear the wealthy women in their designer gowns whispering prayers of protection. I watched Preston slowly regain his color. The arrogant smirk began to creep back onto his face as he realized my father was throwing a massive religious blanket over his financial crimes. Kiara wiped her fake tears and nodded along, playing the part of the heartbroken but forgiving sister. Ezekiel's voice boomed through the speakers and bounced off the crystal chandeliers above us. He demanded that the elders lay hands on me. He wanted them to physically surround me and escort me out under the guise of a spiritual intervention. Pastor Miller arrived at the table holding a small vial of anointing oil. His face was a mask of practiced pastoral concern, but his eyes were darting nervously toward the frozen projector screens that still displayed Preston's massive offshore gambling debts. The pastor reached out his hand, intending to place it on my forehead to cast out whatever rebellious demon my father claimed was possessing me. I calmly raised my left hand and held it up just inches from the pastor's wrist. I did not touch him, but the absolute freezing authority in my gesture made him stop dead in his tracks. He lowered his hand. "You are a phenomenal actor, Dad," I said softly. My voice was completely steady, lacking any of the hysteria he had just accused me of possessing. "You have always known exactly how to weaponize faith to cover up your own sins. You stand up there Sunday after Sunday selling salvation to people who trust you, and then you use their devotion as a shield the second someone questions your accounting. But prayer is not going to fix your balance sheet tonight, and casting out imaginary demons will not replenish the accounts you drained." I reached down to the floor beside my chair, where I had placed my designer leather tote bag. I unzipped the main compartment and pulled out a thick stack of glossy, professionally bound folders. I did not bring just one copy. I had prepared a dozen identical dossiers. They were heavy-packed with certified bank records, offshore routing numbers, and tax documents that I had legally acquired through my clearance. I picked up the first folder and slid it smoothly across the linen tablecloth directly toward Pastor Miller. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. "Open it, Pastor," I instructed, keeping my tone respectful but utterly commanding. "You have a fiduciary duty to your congregation, do you not? You have a legal obligation to understand where the donations are going." I then stood up slowly, smoothing the front of my emerald gown. I picked up 3 more folders and walked gracefully around the table. The security guards who had been called earlier stepped forward, but the mayor of Atlanta raised his hand to stop them. He was a shrewd politician who smelled blood in the water, and he was not about to let security silence someone who was handing out evidence of massive financial fraud. I handed one folder directly to the mayor. I handed another to the senior city councilman who sat beside him. I handed the third to the chairman of the church finance committee, who was staring at my father with a look of dawning horror. Ezekiel lunged forward, trying to snatch the folders out of my hands. "Those are forged!" he screamed, his voice cracking with sheer panic. "Do not look at those papers. They are manufactured lies designed to destroy the good work we do for this city. She is sick in the head." The mayor ignored my father completely. He flipped open the heavy cover of the dossier. The first page was a brightly highlighted summary of the church building fund. It was the same fund my father had spent the last 3 years aggressively promoting. "Let us talk about your good work, Dad," I said, projecting my voice so the entire room could hear every single syllable. 2 years ago, you stood before a congregation of 10,000 people and asked them to dig deep into their pockets. You asked single mothers to give up their savings. You asked the elderly to donate their pension checks. You raised $5 million in cold, hard cash. You promised them you were going to build a state-of-the-art youth center in South Atlanta. You showed them blueprints and architectural renderings of a safe haven for at-risk teenagers. I walked back to my chair and stood behind it, resting my hands on the velvet back. The mayor turned the page of his folder. His eyes widened behind his wire-rimmed glasses. The chairman of the finance committee let out a sharp, breathless gasp as he read the corresponding bank statements. Deacon Ezekiel raised $5 million for a new youth center. I continued, my voice slicing through the heavy silence of the ballroom. But that money never went to a construction firm. It never went to architects or city planners. If you look at page 4 of that dossier, you will see the exact wire transfers. Every single dollar of that church fund was routed directly into a private account in the Cayman Islands. An account registered to a shell company owned exclusively by Preston Vance. Preston staggered backward, hitting the edge of the stage behind him. He looked like he was going to vomit. The sophisticated Wall Street facade had completely melted away, leaving nothing but a terrified, exposed criminal. Kiera began to hyperventilate, clutching her stomach and looking around wildly for an exit. "You did not build a youth center, Dad," I said, staring directly into Ezekiel's terrified eyes. "You did not lay a single brick for the community. You took $5 million of holy money and you handed it directly to your white son-in-law to plug the massive holes in his failing hedge fund. You bought Preston's silence because he knew you were embezzling from the commercial real estate firm. You sold out your own people, your own congregation, just to keep your fake empire from collapsing." The uproar in the ballroom was instantaneous and deafening. The wealthy church donors who had defended my father just moments ago were now standing up from their tables, shouting in absolute outrage. The jazz band musicians quietly packed their instruments and slipped out the back doors. The mayor slammed the folder down on the table and signaled his aides to get him out of the building before the press arrived. The chairman of the finance committee grabbed my father by the lapels of his expensive tuxedo, screaming in his face, demanding to know where the money had gone. The entire facade of their black excellence, their untouchable religious superiority, was burning to the ground right in front of them. My father tried to push the chairman away, sputtering nonsensical defenses, but nobody was listening to him anymore. The evidence was right there in black and white, printed on certified bank letterheads. Suddenly, a piercing theatrical scream shattered the chaos in the room. Corinne, my manipulative stepmother, had realized that the financial trap was completely inescapable. She saw the mayor leaving. She saw the elders turning on her husband. She knew that there was absolutely no logical way to explain away the offshore wire transfers. So she resorted to the only tactic she had left in her arsenal. She went for ultimate unhinged character assassination. Corinne threw her hands up in the air and collapsed backward against the catering table. She knocked over a towering display of champagne flutes, sending broken glass and expensive liquor crashing to the marble floor. She slid down the side of the table, landing in a heap of designer silk and broken crystal. She began to wail loudly, clutching her chest and gasping for air as if she were having a massive heart attack. Ezekiel abandoned the angry finance chairman and rushed to his wife's side, playing the role of the terrified, devoted husband. But Corinne did not want medical attention. She wanted an audience. She pushed Ezekiel away and pointed a trembling manicured finger directly at my face. "Do not believe a word she says," Corinne shrieked, her voice echoing over the angry shouts of the congregation. "She is making all of this up to destroy us because her blood is tainted. We tried to hide it to protect her, but the truth is finally coming out. She is just like her biological mother." The room quieted down slightly as people turned to watch the hysterical woman on the floor. Corinne sensed the shift in attention and dialed up her performance. She grabbed the hem of her ruined dress and wept loudly. Her mother was nothing but a filthy street-walking crack addict. Corinne screamed, her face contorted with vicious hatred. She was a junkie who left this girl with nothing but bad blood and a broken mind. We took her in. We tried to raise her like a proper child, but you cannot wash the gutter out of someone who was born in it. Her mother died with a needle in her arm, and now this girl has inherited her madness. She is hallucinating these bank records. She is suffering from the same psychotic delusions that killed her crackhead mother. Do not look at those papers. She is a sick, sick girl, and she needs to be locked away in an asylum. Corinne lay on the floor, panting heavily. looking around to see if her outrageous lie had successfully distracted the crowd from the financial ruins staring them in the face. She thought that by weaponizing the memory of my dead mother, she could instantly discredit everything I had just exposed. She thought the elite crowd would instinctively side with the wealthy, respectable stepmother over the supposedly unstable daughter of a drug addict. I stood behind my chair looking down at Corinne as she writhed among the broken champagne glasses. I did not feel an ounce of shame. I did not feel a single drop of the humiliation she was so desperately trying to inflict upon me. Instead, a slow, cold sense of absolute victory settled deep within my bones. She had just handed me the exact opening I needed to deliver the final devastating blow. Corinne dragged herself across the sticky marble floor, ignoring the shards of broken crystal that snagged the delicate silk of her designer gown. She reached out and wrapped her hands around Pastor Miller's ankles, weeping with such theatrical desperation that it would have earned her a standing ovation on a Broadway stage. She buried her face against the pastor's tailored trousers, sobbing about how much she had loved me. She told the room that she had raised me like her very own flesh and blood. She claimed she had brushed my hair and packed my lunches and prayed over me every single night, but the bad blood was simply too strong to overcome. She looked up at the congregation, her mascara running down her cheeks in perfect, calculated dark streaks. "We tried to save her," Corinne wailed, her voice echoing through the silent ballroom. "We did everything we could to pull her back from the edge. Ezekiel did not sell her to a monster. He is a holy man. He is a righteous man who wept tears of pure agony over this girl. We sent her to a therapeutic retreat. It was a strict wilderness rehab facility in the mountains because she was completely out of control. She was using drugs just like her mother. She was stealing from us. We sent her there to heal, and she ran away into the woods because she did not want to be saved." The wealthy donors and church elders shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Corinne was playing into their deepest prejudices and fears. Addiction and mental illness were taboo subjects in this elite circle, and Corinne knew exactly how to weaponize that stigma. I could see the doubt creeping back into the eyes of the city councilmen. I could see Kiera breathing a sigh of relief, hoping that her mother's desperate lie would somehow cast enough doubt to save their glittering empire. Ezekiel stood slightly taller, wiping the sweat from his forehead, playing the part of the grieving, wounded father who had only tried to practice tough love. I did not rush to interrupt her. I let Corinne spin her filthy web until she ran completely out of breath. Then I slowly walked around the edge of the heavy mahogany table. My emerald green gown swept quietly over the floor as I approached the center of the wreckage. I crouched down gracefully, completely unbothered by the spilled alcohol and the broken glass. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver locket I had tossed onto the table earlier that evening. It had fallen to the floor during Ezekiel's violent outburst. The heavy metal felt cool and solid in my palm. I stood back up and looked down at Corinne, who was still clinging to the pastor's leg. She stared at the locket in my hand, her sobbing abruptly hitching in her throat. "You spin a very compelling story, Corinne," I said, my voice dropping to a smooth, melodic cadence that carried perfectly through the hushed room. "A therapeutic wilderness retreat for a troubled teenage addict. It sounds so much better than human trafficking. But there is a minor flaw in your beautiful, tragic narrative." I held the silver locket up by its delicate chain, letting it catch the glow of the crystal chandeliers. "My biological mother gave me this locket right before she died," I explained, looking directly at Ezekiel, whose face had suddenly drained of all remaining color. "She told me to never take it off. She told me it was my protection. What you and Ezekiel never bothered to figure out in your desperate, greedy rush to get rid of me was that this locket was not just a piece of vintage jewelry. It was custom made by my grandfather's security firm." I pressed my thumb against a tiny concealed groove on the side of the silver pendant. With a soft click, the locket opened, revealing a small, highly advanced microdrive nestled inside the casing. I pulled the drive out and walked back to my tablet, which was still securely synced to the ballroom's massive surround sound system. I plugged the drive into the side port of the tablet. "Let us take a quick trip down memory lane," I said, tapping the screen to open the audio file. Let us listen to exactly what kind of therapeutic retreat you booked for me 17 years ago. I pressed play. The ballroom speakers crackled slightly before a crisp, undeniably clear audio recording filled the massive room. It was the sound of a dark moving car, the low hum of a luxury sedan engine driving up a steep mountain road. Then Corinne's voice echoed through the speakers. She sounded 17 years younger, but the vicious cold calculation in her tone was exactly the same. "We are not taking less than 50,000, Ezekiel," the recorded voice of Corinne snapped. Her words bounced off the walls of the country club, freezing every single person in their tracks. "Your real estate debts are drowning us. The church fund is already short, and if the board audits you next month, we are going to federal prison." The man in the cabin said he would pay 50 grand cash for a fresh 15-year-old. We take the bag, we hand her over, and we drive away. Then Ezekiel's recorded voice answered, thick with cowardice and greed. "What if she screams, Corinne? What if someone hears her?" Corinne's recorded laugh was harsh and utterly devoid of humanity. "Let her scream, Ezekiel. We are 50 miles into the Appalachian woods. Nobody is going to hear her. Tell the man he can do whatever he wants with her as long as the bills are unmarked. We will go to church on Sunday and tell Pastor Miller she ran away to do drugs. Everyone will pity us. It is the perfect plan." I tapped the screen, stopping the audio. The silence that followed was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating dead quiet that felt like all the air had been permanently removed from the room. Corinne was no longer weeping. She was sitting on the floor, her hands covering her mouth, her eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked like she had seen a ghost. Ezekiel was clutching the edge of the podium, his knees visibly buckling under his own weight. The senior pastor looked down at Corinne with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. He physically stepped backward, peeling his leg out of her grasp as if she were covered in a deadly disease. "A rehab facility." "Corinne," I asked, my voice echoing loudly in the silent room, "you sold my life for $50,000 in unmarked bills to save Ezekiel from a prison sentence. You handed a 15-year-old girl over to a suspected trafficker in a decaying hunting cabin, and you did not even flinch." The mayor of Atlanta turned his back on the head table, entirely whispering rapid, urgent commands to his security detail to lock the doors and call the police. The elite donors were staring at my father with absolute disgust. The pristine, holy facade of the great Ezekiel had been completely stripped away, leaving nothing but a monster standing naked in front of his entire congregation. But I was not finished. Corinne had opened a door regarding my biological mother, and I was going to rip it entirely off its hinges. I walked over to Corinne and looked down at her shivering form. "You stood up here tonight and told all these respectable people that my mother was a filthy, street-walking crack addict," I said, enunciating every word with razor-sharp precision. "You told them I inherited her bad blood. You told them she died with a needle in her arm. That was the lie you used to justify locking me in the shadows for my entire childhood. That was the lie you used to make yourselves look like charitable saints for taking me in." I swiped my tablet again, projecting a new document onto the 50-foot screens behind the stage. It was a massive, comprehensive trust fund ledger complete with state seals and banking certifications. "My biological mother was not an addict, Corinne," I announced. My voice was steady, but filled with a righteous, blazing anger that made the surrounding guests step back. She was an heiress. She was the sole beneficiary of a massive generational estate located in Chicago. When she died unexpectedly of a completely undetected heart condition, Ezekiel saw an opportunity. You both saw an opportunity. The crowd gasped again, reading the massive numbers flashing on the projector screens. "You did not take me in out of the goodness of your hearts." I continued, pacing slowly in front of the head table. "You took me in because I was the legal inheritor of a $20 million estate. You falsified documents, you stole her identity, and you systematically drained her trust fund to build your initial real estate empire in Atlanta. You used my dead mother's money to buy this fake prestige. And when I turned 15, when I was only 3 years away from legally claiming my inheritance and requesting an audit, you decided it was time to tie up the only loose end. You sold me to a monster to cover your tracks and keep your stolen fortune." Ezekiel dropped to his knees. The great infallible deacon of Atlanta's wealthiest megachurch was sobbing into the carpet, begging for mercy that he absolutely did not deserve. Corinne was curled into a tight ball, shaking violently, unable to look at the massive screens displaying her financial crimes and her stolen wealth. The church elders were already on their phones calling their own lawyers, trying to distance themselves from the radioactive crater that was now my father's life. They were completely ruined. Their legacy was reduced to ash. Their social standing, their wealth, their holy superiority. Everything had been obliterated by the truth they had tried to bury in those woods 17 years ago. But while Ezekiel and Corinne were collapsing into pathetic heaps on the floor, Preston Vance was experiencing a completely different kind of panic. He was not just embarrassed. He was legally and financially trapped in a corner with no way out. He realized instantly that if his in-laws were going down in a highly publicized federal fraud and embezzlement scandal, his own offshore shell companies would be investigated by the authorities by morning. The $12 million loan he defaulted on would be called in. The casino debt in Macau would become a death sentence. Preston's eyes turned dark and frantic. He looked at the massive projector screens and then he looked at the sleek tablet in my hand. He knew that tablet held the keys to his entire destruction. He needed to silence me immediately, and he needed to take control of the digital evidence before the police walked through the ballroom doors. He snapped his fingers violently, signaling the two ruthless defense attorneys who had been waiting on standby. The attorneys did not hesitate. They moved with frightening speed, flanking me on both sides, cutting off my path to the exit. Their faces were grim and completely devoid of emotion. Preston lunged forward, blocking my path from the front. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thickly folded legal document. His hands were shaking, but his eyes were filled with a dangerous, unhinged desperation. He slapped the document down onto the mahogany table right over the spilled champagne. "You are going to sign this right now, Vivica Preston," hissed his voice, dropping to a low, vicious threat that only I and his lawyers could hear. "It is a blanket non-disclosure agreement and a full transfer of digital rights. You are going to sign over that tablet, you are going to retract your statements about my firm, and you are going to walk out that back door quietly." One of the defense attorneys stepped closer, crowding my personal space purposefully, trying to use his physical bulk to trap me against the heavy table. He pulled a gold fountain pen from his pocket and pressed it aggressively into my hand. "You have 30 seconds to sign the paper," Vivica Preston whispered, leaning in so close I could feel the panicked heat radiating from his skin. "Or my men will take that tablet from you by force, and we will make sure you never see the light of day again. Now sign it." I looked down at the heavy gold pen in my hand. The two lawyers shifted closer, their expensive tailored suits brushing against my bare shoulders. One of them subtly unbuttoned his suit jacket, revealing the faint but unmistakable bulge of a shoulder holster strapped across his chest. They were not just corporate attorneys, they were high-priced fixers. They were the kind of men Preston paid exorbitant amounts of money to make his worst problems disappear quietly in the dark. I glanced past them toward the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the lavish ballroom. 2 more security guards had moved to block the main exits, crossing their thick arms and standing shoulder to shoulder. No one was leaving this room until Preston Vance got exactly what he wanted. Preston leaned his knuckles heavily on the table, his breath hot and ragged. He thought he had me completely cornered. He thought he had just played the ultimate trump card in a game I could not possibly win. "You think you are the only one who knows how to dig up buried financial records, Vivica?" He sneered, his voice a low, venomous whisper that barely carried past the shattered crystal on our table. "I have known about your biological mother's estate for 6 months. I know that the primary trust fund she established for you matures tonight at exactly midnight. $20 million sitting in a locked account waiting for your signature. And you are going to sign every single penny of that trust over to Ezekiel right now." He stood up slightly straighter, his chest puffing out as he outlined his brilliant master plan. "Ezekiel will then transfer those funds directly into my holding company." Preston continued, his eyes wide and manic with desperate, unadulterated greed. "That money will cover the massive margin call. It will pay off the debt collectors in Macau. It will rebuild the pediatric clinic fund before tomorrow morning, and no one in this city will ever know what happened here tonight. You are going to save this family, Vivica, and you are going to do it with a smile on your face, because if you do not, I will take that tablet from you by force, and I will call the police. I will have you arrested for corporate espionage, illegal hacking, and cyber terrorism. I stared at him, letting his threats wash over me without blinking. I will completely ruin you, Preston hissed, leaning so close I could see the thick sweat beading on his forehead. I play golf with the district attorney. I fund the election campaigns of half the judges sitting on the bench in this state. Do you really think they are going to believe your wild story over mine? Do you honestly think they care about some fabricated digital evidence on a stolen tablet? To them, I am a respectable pillar of the community, and you are just a black girl from a broken home trying to extort successful people. You are absolutely nothing. You have zero power in this room. They will lock you in federal prison for the rest of your natural life, and Ezekiel and Corinne will gladly testify under oath that you have been clinically insane since childhood. Now pick up the pen and sign the paper. I slowly looked up from the dense legal document, meeting Preston's frantic, bloodshot eyes. Ezekiel had pulled himself up from the floor, clutching the edge of the tablecloth, his breathing shallow and incredibly erratic. He was staring at the legal document like it was a holy life raft sent directly from heaven to save his fraudulent empire. Corinne had stopped her hysterical theatrical sobbing. She was still sitting on the marble floor among the broken champagne glasses, but her eyes were fixed on my hand, practically begging me to sign away my mother's legacy to save her luxurious, untouchable lifestyle. Kiara was standing a few feet away, holding her pregnant stomach, her face a mask of complete shock, as she watched her wealthy husband actively try to extort and threaten her estranged sister. The lawyer to my right tapped his finger impatiently against the mahogany table. The gold fountain pen felt heavy and cold between my fingers. I looked down at the thick stack of legal paper Preston had thrown in front of me. It was a standard transfer of assets agreement, drafted with aggressive ironclad language meant to completely strip me of all my rights. It transferred the entirety of the maturing trust directly into Ezekiel's name, with Preston listed as the primary managing executor with full financial authority. It was a flawless legal trap designed by ruthless men who thought they were always the smartest people in the room. I did not argue with him. I did not plead or bargain or beg for my freedom. I simply uncapped the gold fountain pen. The sharp scratch of the metal nib against the thick parchment sounded incredibly loud in the tense, suffocating silence of the VIP section. I wrote my name with careful, elegant, deliberate strokes, signing on the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. I even added my middle initial just to make it perfectly official and legally binding. Before I could even lift the pen from the paper, Preston snatched the document out of my hands. He let out a loud, breathless bark of laughter. It was the frantic sound of a man who had just outrun a speeding train by a fraction of a second. He waved the signed paper in the air, his face flushed with arrogant, supreme victory. "See that, Ezekiel?" Preston shouted, turning to my father, who was now weeping with profound relief. "I told you I would fix this mess. I handle the problems. I protect this family's legacy." He turned to the defense attorneys, snapping his fingers with absolute authority. "Get this filed with the courts immediately. Initiate the wire transfers the second midnight hits. Pay off Macau and put the rest of the cash into the offshore holding account. We are done here. Security, get this crazy woman out of my sight." I carefully placed the cap back onto the gold fountain pen and set it down neatly next to my tablet. I leaned back in my velvet dining chair, crossing my legs and resting my hands calmly in my lap. I looked up at Preston, who was practically vibrating with triumphant adrenaline. "Are you absolutely certain you want your lawyers to file that paperwork, Preston?" I asked, my voice cutting through his celebration like a shard of pure ice. Preston stopped laughing. He looked down at me, his arrogant sneer returning in full force. "What is the matter, Vivica?" he mocked, slipping the signed document into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. "Are you having buyer's remorse already? It is too late. Your signature is on the dotted line. You just bought your freedom and you do not even get a thank you card." I smiled. It was not a small, polite smile. It was a wide, genuine smile that completely reached my eyes. It was the smile of an apex predator who had just watched its prey willingly step into a steel trap and lock the door from the inside. I had spent 17 long years planning a singular flawless moment of absolute destruction, and Preston Vance had just executed it for me perfectly. "Did you actually read the fine print of the trust document, Preston?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "Did you bother to look at the portfolio attached to the estate before you forced me to sign it over to you?" Preston frowned, his hand freezing over his jacket pocket. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice suddenly losing a fraction of its booming, unshakable confidence. "You see, Preston, my biological mother did leave me a $20 million estate." I explained, my words flowing smoothly and calmly across the table. "But Ezekiel and Corinne drained the liquid cash years ago. They stole my mother's money to build their church and launch their real estate firm. They emptied the accounts completely while I was just a child. But a trust cannot just be dissolved, especially when it is legally tied to commercial property holdings. So the trust sat completely empty for a very long time." The two defense attorneys exchanged a sharp, incredibly nervous glance. One of them reached out and pulled the folded document back out of Preston's pocket, flipping rapidly through the pages to the portfolio attachments at the very back of the agreement. Until last year, I continued standing up slowly from my chair. The emerald silk of my gown rustled quietly in the silent room. I took control of the trust anonymously through my own legal team. I knew you were desperate, Preston. I knew you were secretly moving Ezekiel's stolen church funds into your bleeding hedge fund to stay afloat. So I used the empty shell of my mother's trust to purchase the debt of your failing commercial real estate ventures." Preston stopped breathing. The color began to drain from his face, leaving him looking like a sick, pale ghost. "I bought every single toxic asset your firm tried to dump," I said, stepping closer to him. "I bought the bad mortgages, the defaulted commercial loans, the empty suburban strip malls that you bankrupted. I packed my mother's empty trust with $15 million of your absolute worst financial garbage." The lawyer standing next to Preston let out a low, horrified curse. He dropped the document onto the table and physically took a step away from Preston, as if the man had suddenly caught on fire. "And according to the liability clause you just aggressively forced me to sign," I said, my voice echoing in his ears. "The signatory who assumes control of the trust automatically assumes full personal and corporate liability for all debts held within it." "You thought you were stealing $20 million in cash?" "Preston," I whispered, leaning in so he could hear the absolute finality in my voice. "But the trust is not holding cash. It is holding $15 million of your own toxic debt. And by forcing me to sign that transfer, you just legally assumed all of Ezekiel's massive liabilities. You just tied your personal name, your prestigious firm, and your remaining assets directly to a $15 million black hole. You did not save the family, Preston. You just legally bankrupted yourself and handed the federal investigators a signed, notarized confession of your corporate negligence." The lawyer standing to Preston's right dropped the transfer document as if the paper itself had suddenly caught fire. He took 2 rapid steps backward, bumping into a waiter who was still frozen in shock, holding a silver tray of appetizers. The second attorney did not even bother looking at the paperwork. He took one look at my perfectly calm face, saw the absolute certainty in my eyes, and immediately began backing away toward the emergency exit. They were highly paid corporate fixers, but they were not fools. They knew exactly what it looked like when a trap snapped shut, and neither of them had any intention of being caught in the blast radius of a $15 million federal fraud investigation. Preston snatched the thick stack of papers from the mahogany table. His hands were shaking so violently that the pages rustled against each other. He stared at the dense legal jargon he had been too arrogant and too desperate to read thoroughly. He flipped to the back of the agreement where the portfolio schedules were attached. His eyes darted across the itemized list of commercial failures, the defaulted loans, the empty strip malls, and the toxic mortgages he thought he had successfully buried. And right at the bottom, next to my signature, was the liability clause he had just enthusiastically stamped with his own corporate seal. He stopped breathing. The ruddy, angry color completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. He looked like a man who had just stepped off a cliff and was suspended in mid-air, waiting for gravity to pull him down into the abyss. Kiera watched her husband physically crumble. She stood up from her chair, her hands moving from her pregnant belly to her perfectly styled hair, gripping the expensive strands as her flawless world dissolved into pure ash. She stepped toward him, her diamond heels clicking unsteadily on the sticky marble floor. "Preston," she whispered, her voice cracking with a high-pitched, terrifying uncertainty. "Preston, what does she mean? What is a liability clause? Where is the money for my baby?" She reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his bespoke suit, pulling on the expensive fabric like a frightened child seeking reassurance. She expected him to wrap his arm around her. She expected him to flash that confident Wall Street smile and tell her that everything was going to be fine, that he would protect her from her crazy, bitter sister. But Preston did not look at her with love or reassurance. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. The charming, supportive husband persona he had cultivated for years completely shattered, revealing the ruthless, parasitic monster lurking just beneath the surface. He violently shoved her hands away from his jacket. "Shut up, Kiera," he barked, his voice loud and vicious, echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "Just shut your mouth for 1 single minute." Kiera gasped, stumbling backward and catching herself against the edge of the table. She looked at him as if he had just struck her across the face. "You cannot talk to me like that," she cried, her voice rising to a hysterical, shrill pitch. "I am your wife. We are building a legacy together. You told me we were the most powerful couple in Atlanta. You promised me the pediatric clinic. You promised me the Buckhead estate. Where did my money go, Preston? You gave our future to a casino." Preston turned on her, his face twisted into a mask of ugly, unfiltered hatred. The polite society smile was entirely gone, replaced by a sneering, deeply ingrained prejudice that he had expertly hidden behind his corporate superiority. "Your money." Preston laughed, a harsh, cruel sound that made the surrounding guests flinch. "It was never your money, Kiera. It was stolen church funds that your fraudulent father handed over to me because he was too incompetent to manage his own real estate firm. You actually thought I cared about your fake high society family. You thought I wanted to sit through endless, suffocating Sunday dinners listening to your father preach about salvation while he was secretly funneling me untaxed cash just to keep his own head above water." Kiera let out a small, wounded sob, but Preston stepped closer to her, using his physical size to tower over her trembling frame. He was lashing out like a cornered animal, desperate to inflict pain on the easiest target in the room. "You were nothing but a bankroll." "Kiera," he sneered, leaning down so his face was inches from hers. "You were a convenient, heavily funded prop. A naive, spoiled girl who was so desperate for validation from a white investment broker that you never once questioned where the millions were coming from. I needed capital to cover my losses, and your corrupt father was the easiest mark in the city. You and this entire pathetic family are nothing but a joke to the people I actually do business with. You are a walking ATM, and now that the account is empty, you are completely useless to me." The elite crowd watched in absolute stunned silence as their perfect golden couple tore each other apart. The mayor of Atlanta had completely stopped moving, watching the spectacular implosion of the city's most prominent family. The church elders who had adored Kiera since she was a little girl were staring at Preston with open, undisguised fury. Kiera began to weep openly, her hands covering her face as the utter humiliation washed over her. She had spent her entire life stepping on my neck to elevate herself, building an identity based entirely on her wealth and her perceived superiority. And now the man she had anchored her entire identity to was telling the entire world that she was nothing but a gullible, heavily funded joke. But I was not finished. Preston thought he could deflect his own ruin by tearing down his wife, but he had no idea how deep my preparation went. I reached into my leather tote bag one more time. I bypassed the thick financial dossiers and pulled out a plain, thin manila folder. It did not contain bank statements or routing numbers, but it was infinitely more devastating than anything I had shown them so far. I did not hand this folder to the mayor or the city councilman. I walked gracefully around the table, stepping past Ezekiel, who was still kneeling on the floor, clutching the podium like a drowning man. I walked directly over to Kiera. She looked up at me through her tears, her mascara running down her cheeks in dark, jagged lines. The arrogant golden child had finally been brought low. I held the plain folder out to her. "You might want to look at this before you plan your divorce strategy." "Kiera," I said softly, my voice calm and steady amidst the chaos. "Because you are going to have a very hard time claiming half of his assets when your marriage is not even legally valid." Kiera stared at the folder as if it were a bomb waiting to detonate. Her trembling hands reached out, and she slowly flipped open the heavy paper cover. Inside were dozens of high-resolution 8x10 photographs. They were not corporate headshots or gala pictures. They were candid domestic family photos. She stared at the first image. It was a picture of a beautiful, sprawling colonial home located in a wealthy, manicured suburb of Connecticut. The second photo showed a smiling blonde woman standing on the front porch, holding a golden retriever puppy. The third photo showed Preston Vance wearing casual weekend clothes, pushing a young boy on a bicycle, while a little girl ran through a sprinkler in the front yard. They looked incredibly happy. They looked exactly like the perfect traditional family Preston pretended to be building in Atlanta. "That is Emily Vance." I explained, my voice carrying clearly through the hushed ballroom, ensuring that every single guest heard the final nail being hammered into Preston's coffin. "She is a lovely woman who thinks her husband travels to Atlanta 5 days a week for corporate consulting. She has been married to Preston for 12 years. They have a 7-year-old son and a 5-year-old daughter." Preston spun around, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it looked like his heart had simply stopped beating. He lunged toward me, trying to snatch the folder out of Kiera's hands, but I stepped back smoothly, letting him stumble awkwardly over his own feet. "He never divorced her, Kiera." I continued, my gaze locked on my sister's horrified face. "He just moved down here and found a wealthy megachurch family desperate for corporate validation to fund his double life. He forged his marriage documents in Georgia. You are not his wife, Kiera. You have no legal standing. You are nothing but his unwitting, heavily pregnant mistress." Kiera let out a sound of pure, unadulterated agony. It was a visceral, gut-wrenching wail that echoed off the high ceilings and made the crystal chandeliers seem to vibrate. She dropped the folder, letting the photographs of Preston's real family scatter across the sticky floor, right next to where Corinne was still curled into a ball. The betrayal was so absolute, so entirely consuming, that Kiera simply folded in on herself, sinking to her knees and weeping uncontrollably into her hands. The golden child, the undisputed princess of the Piedmont Country Club, had been reduced to a public tragic spectacle, entirely stripped of her pride, her wealth, and her marriage in less than 20 minutes. Preston stood in the center of the wreckage, completely paralyzed. He realized the sheer gravity of the trap he was standing in. His secret Connecticut life was exposed for the entire world to see. His multi-million-dollar fraud and embezzlement scheme was projected on 50-foot screens behind him. His wealthy investors were calling the authorities, and he was now legally tethered to $15 million in toxic, unpayable debt. He turned to look for his defense attorneys, but the two men in the charcoal suits were long gone, having abandoned him the second they realized he was a walking federal indictment. Preston was completely and utterly trapped, with absolutely nowhere left to run. The sheer, insurmountable panic finally broke his mind. His Wall Street composure shattered into a million sharp, jagged pieces of hysterical fear. He whipped his head around, his eyes scanning the room until they landed on Ezekiel. My father was still kneeling by the podium, sweating profusely, looking like a man standing before a firing squad. He was gripping his Bible, trying desperately to look like a holy victim of circumstances. But Preston was not about to let his father-in-law play the innocent martyr. If Preston was going to burn, he was going to make sure the great Ezekiel burned right alongside him. Preston marched toward the podium, his face purple with unhinged rage. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at my father's face. "I am not going down alone!" Preston screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical, desperate volume. "Do not look at me like I am the only criminal in this room. Stop praying, Ezekiel. Stop pretending you are a man of God. You knew exactly what you were doing. I am not going to let you pin this entire financial collapse on me. Ezekiel signed the fraudulent tax returns. Preston's words hung in the suffocating air of the ballroom like a toxic cloud. He had just pointed the ultimate finger of blame at the man who had protected him for years. Ezekiel stared at his son-in-law with an expression of pure gutted shock. The holy man facade evaporated instantly, leaving behind a terrified old coward who realized he was about to spend the rest of his natural life in a federal penitentiary. Ezekiel scrambled backward on the marble floor, his expensive tuxedo jacket tearing at the seam. He looked wildly around the room at the disgusted faces of his congregation, and then his terrified eyes landed on his wife. Corinne was still sitting among the broken champagne flutes, but Ezekiel did not look at her with love or protection. He looked at her like a human shield. Ezekiel pointed a trembling finger directly at Corinne and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He told the entire room that he knew absolutely nothing about the complex tax laws or the offshore accounts. He wailed that he was just a simple pastor, a man of faith who trusted his wife to handle the church finances. He threw Corinne entirely under the bus without a single second of hesitation. He claimed she was the ultimate mastermind behind the entire embezzlement scheme. He shouted that she had forced him to sign those fraudulent tax returns because she was greedy and obsessed with maintaining her lavish high society lifestyle. He told the mayor and the city councilmen that Corinne had manipulated the ledgers behind his back to steal from the congregation so she could buy her designer clothes and fund her expensive luxury vacations to Europe. He sobbed, completely abandoning his dignity, claiming he was just an innocent victim of his wife's wicked deception. Corinne froze on the floor. Her fake theatrical tears stopped instantly. The absolute shock of her husband betraying her in front of the most powerful people in Atlanta snapped something deep inside her fragile mind. The pristine, wealthy pastor's wife vanished entirely. Corinne let out a feral, ear-piercing shriek that sounded like a wounded animal. She scrambled up from the puddle of spilled alcohol, ignoring the sharp pieces of broken glass that sliced into her knees and tore the delicate silk of her designer gown. She did not just yell at him. She threw her entire body directly at Ezekiel with sheer vicious, murderous intent. Her perfectly manicured hands curled into tight claws, and she raked them violently across Ezekiel's face. She tore deep, bleeding scratches down his cheek and across his jawline. Ezekiel screamed in high-pitched pain, throwing his arms up to protect his face, but Corinne was completely unhinged. She grabbed him by his expensive silk tie, twisting the fabric tightly around his thick neck, and yanked him violently down toward the floor. They tumbled hard into the wreckage of the fallen chairs, rolling over shattered plates and ruined catering displays. Corinne was screaming at the top of her lungs, calling him a pathetic, weak coward and a worthless excuse for a man. She screamed that he was the one who authorized every single offshore transfer and that he was going to burn in hell for trying to pin his filthy crimes on her. Ezekiel threw wild, desperate punches trying to shove her off him, but she clung to him, tearing at his hair and ripping his tuxedo shirt wide open. Kiera stood a few feet away, clutching her pregnant stomach, watching her parents literally tear each other to bloody pieces on the floor of the Piedmont Country Club. She was hyperventilating, unable to speak or move, completely paralyzed by the absolute destruction of her perfect family. The elite members of the congregation did not step forward to help. The wealthy donors and the church elders who had once treated my family like untouchable royalty simply backed away in absolute horror. But then the most fascinating and disgusting thing happened. Pastor Miller, the man who had tried to anoint me with holy oil just 20 minutes ago, pulled his sleek smartphone out of his pocket and hit the record button. The city councilmen immediately followed suit. The wealthy women in their glittering designer gowns held up their phones, capturing every single second of the brutal, undignified brawl. The great Ezekiel and his perfect wife were beating each other bloody on the floor, and the entire high society of Atlanta was happily filming it for the evening news. Their holy legacy was not just ruined, it was becoming viral internet entertainment. I did not intervene. I did not try to stop the violence or defend my father. I simply stepped away from the chaotic center of the room and walked gracefully over to the untouched side of the catering bar. I picked up a pristine crystal flute and calmly poured myself a fresh glass of expensive vintage champagne. The cool liquid bubbled perfectly over the rim of the glass. I took a slow, deliberate sip, enjoying the crisp, dry taste on my tongue. The champagne tasted like absolute victory. I walked back towards the center of the stage, carrying my glass in one hand. I reached out and picked up the heavy wireless microphone from the fallen podium. I tapped the microphone twice. The sharp, heavy thud echoed loudly over the ballroom surround sound system, easily cutting through the pathetic sounds of Corinne and Ezekiel screaming and fighting on the floor. I raised the microphone to my lips. I looked directly into the glowing lenses of the dozens of cell phones recording the scene, and I began to speak. I narrated their entire criminal enterprise with the cold, clinical precision of a federal prosecutor delivering an opening statement. I wanted to make sure that every single person recording this spectacle captured the undeniable legal truth of their massive financial crimes. I told the room exactly how Ezekiel set up a fake charitable holding account under the guise of the Youth Center Building Fund. I explained that the donations were never meant for the community, but were systematically funneled into a private domestic shell company called Genesis Holdings. I spoke clearly, ensuring my voice carried over the chaos, detailing how Preston Vance then took control of Genesis Holdings and used his corporate authority to wire those untaxed funds directly into his failing hedge fund accounts in the Cayman Islands. I did not stop there. I listed the exact dates of the largest wire transfers. I recited the specific amounts of federal tax evasion, detailing how they manipulated the church's tax-exempt status to launder over $15 million in stolen congregation money. I explained that Preston used the stolen cash to cover his massive illegal margin calls and to hide the toxic debt his firm had accumulated over the last 4 years. I made sure everyone heard how Preston bought my father's silence by promising him a seat on the board of a non-existent commercial real estate venture. I laid out every single piece of the puzzle connecting the stolen tithes directly to Preston's lavish lifestyle and Ezekiel's fraudulent tax returns. The guests kept recording their phones, capturing my calm, steady narration, while my parents continued their pathetic brawl in the background. I took another slow sip of my champagne, perfectly composed and utterly untouched by the destruction happening at my feet. I was sealing their fate in digital stone. When these videos inevitably made their way to the FBI and the IRS, there would be absolutely zero confusion about how the money was stolen and who was responsible. I was handing the federal investigators a perfectly packaged public confession, broadcast directly from the mouths of Atlanta's most elite citizens. Suddenly, the shrill, piercing sound of approaching sirens cut through the heavy oak doors of the country club. The wailing sound grew louder and louder rapidly, surrounding the building from every possible side. Brilliant, flashing red and blue lights began to bounce violently against the tall, arched ballroom windows, painting the crystal chandeliers and the terrified faces of the guests in harsh, shifting colors of police emergency. The authorities had finally arrived. The entire ballroom froze as the reality of the sirens set in. The crowd murmured in genuine panic, stepping further back from the main doors and lowering their phones. Preston, who had been standing completely paralyzed by the sudden collapse of his entire world, slowly lifted his head. He looked at the flashing red and blue lights painting the walls, and then he turned to look at me. His pristine Wall Street facade had entirely melted away, leaving behind a deeply unhinged man who had nothing left to lose. Preston threw his head back and began to laugh. It was not a normal laugh. It was a manic, hysterical roaring sound that shook his entire chest and echoed terribly in the silent room. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face as the emergency lights flashed across his crazed, bloodshot eyes. "I called the police on you, Vivica!" Preston screamed over the deafening sound of the blaring sirens, his voice cracking with pure, desperate madness. "You think you are so smart. You think you won this game, but you are the one going down tonight." I reported you to the federal authorities the second you showed those documents. I told them you hacked my private corporate servers. You stole that financial data illegally to extort my family. You committed federal cybercrimes to get those bank statements, and you are going away to federal prison for corporate espionage and cyber terrorism. I am going to watch them put you in handcuffs right now and lock you away in a dark cell where you belong. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were violently thrown open. A flood of federal agents swarmed into the opulent space, moving with a terrifying, practiced efficiency. They wore dark tactical windbreakers with the bright yellow letters of the FBI and the IRS stamped clearly across their backs. The harsh reality of federal law enforcement crashed headfirst into the glittering fantasy of Atlanta high society. Wealthy donors screamed and scrambled backward, knocking over towering crystal centerpieces and abandoning their expensive designer clutch purses on the sticky marble floor. The harsh flashing red and blue lights from the emergency vehicles outside pulsed violently through the tall arched ballroom windows, painting the terrified faces of the congregation in shifting colors of absolute panic. Preston stood up straighter, adjusting the lapels of his ruined bespoke suit. He actually smiled. He looked at the armed federal agents storming the room, and his deeply ingrained arrogance blinded him completely to his own reality. He truly believed his status and his wealth made him untouchable. He pointed a long, trembling finger directly at my chest and began shouting orders at the federal investigators as if they were his own private security team. "Arrest her!" Preston bellowed, his voice carrying over the chaos of the panicked crowd. "She is the one you want. She hacked my corporate servers. She committed federal cybercrimes. I am Preston Vance, and I demand you take this woman into custody immediately." The agents did not even look at him. They moved straight past the weeping society wives and the terrified city councilmen, securing all the exits and physically blocking the elevators. Preston kept shouting, repeating his name and his prestigious title, expecting the world to bow to his command, just like it always did. While Preston was busy barking useless orders at the federal government, my father had finally realized the absolute gravity of the situation. Ezekiel did not care about Preston. He did not care about Corinne, who was still sobbing hysterically on the marble floor amidst the shattered glass. Ezekiel only cared about saving his own skin. I watched my father quietly slip away from the overturned head table. He ducked behind a massive, towering floral arrangement and began creeping toward the heavy swinging doors of the catering kitchen. He thought he could just disappear into the shadows and abandon his family to face the federal indictments alone. He pushed open the kitchen door, his eyes wide with cowardly desperation, but he did not make it far. A massive federal agent stepped out from the shadows of the service hallway. Ezekiel let out a pathetic, high-pitched squeal and tried to turn around and run, but the agent was incredibly fast. He grabbed my father by the collar of his expensive torn tuxedo and slammed him violently against the stainless steel wall of the kitchen entrance. Ezekiel crumpled to the floor, wheezing and sputtering as the agent pressed a heavy tactical boot into his back, pulling his arms roughly behind him. The great holy prophet of Atlanta was pinned to the greasy floor next to a tray of discarded appetizers, whining about his bad back, while cold steel handcuffs were ratcheted tightly around his wrists. Back in the main ballroom, Preston was losing his mind. He stomped his expensive leather shoe against the floor, demanding that someone listen to him. The lead FBI agent, a tall, imposing woman with sharp eyes and a completely unreadable expression, walked directly toward the center of the room. Preston puffed out his chest, preparing to give his official statement as a wealthy victim of cyber terrorism. The agent walked right past him. She did not even acknowledge his existence. She stopped directly in front of me. The entire ballroom held its collective breath, waiting to see me placed in handcuffs. Kiera was watching with wide, terrified eyes, hoping against hope that her husband was right, and that I was the one going to federal prison. The lead agent looked at me and reached out her right hand. I took it, and we shook hands firmly in front of the entire stunned congregation. "Good evening, Ms. Williams," the agent said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent room. "We received the encrypted drive and the hard copies of the offshore routing numbers you transmitted. Excellent work as always. Preston staggered backward, hitting the edge of the stage behind him. He looked like the air had been physically punched out of his lungs. His jaw worked uselessly, trying to form words that his panicked brain could no longer process. Corinne stopped weeping and simply stared at the federal agent, shaking my hand in pure bewildered horror. "You cannot do that!" Preston stammered, his voice reduced to a pathetic, high-pitched wheeze. "She is a criminal. She stole my data." I raised the heavy wireless microphone to my lips one more time. I looked at the broken, pathetic remnants of my family and I delivered the final devastating truth. "I forgot to mention my actual job title to you earlier this evening," I said, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of mercy. "I told you that I am the Chief Executive Officer of Apex Acquisitions. That part is entirely true. I run a highly successful private financial firm. But I omitted a rather important detail about my primary client base." I stepped closer to Preston, looking deep into his terrified, bloodshot eyes. "I also work as a specialized contracted corporate liquidator for the Internal Revenue Service," I announced. "I am the person the federal government hires when they need to untangle massive, complicated offshore embezzlement rings. They send me in when wealthy, arrogant men like you use shell companies and corrupt megachurches to hide millions of dollars in stolen, untaxed funds. I did not hack your servers, Preston. I did not commit corporate espionage. I legally subpoenaed your entire digital infrastructure using a federal warrant signed by a federal judge." Kiera let out another low, agonizing wail from the corner of the room. She finally understood that I had not just outsmarted them. I had been hunting them with the full backing of the United States government. Every single move I made was meticulously documented, legally sanctioned, and officially authorized. There was absolutely no loophole for them to crawl through. There was no expensive defense attorney who could save them from a trap built by the federal authorities. The lead agent turned slowly to face Preston. "Preston Vance, you are under arrest for federal wire fraud, tax evasion, and money laundering," she announced, her voice loud and authoritative. Two armed agents stepped forward, grabbing Preston by the arms and twisting them roughly behind his back. Preston tried to struggle, shouting that he was a wealthy man, that he knew the governor, that they were making a terrible mistake. The agents completely ignored his frantic protests, pulling his wrists together and securing the heavy steel handcuffs. The crisp, metallic click echoed loudly through the ballroom, sealing his absolute destruction. His pristine Wall Street facade had entirely melted away, leaving behind a deeply unhinged man who had nothing left to lose. Another pair of agents moved toward Corinne. She was still sitting in a puddle of spilled champagne, surrounded by the scattered photographs of Preston's secret Connecticut family. She looked up at the federal agents with an expression of pure, bewildered denial. "Please," Corinne whispered, her voice shaking with pathetic desperation. "I am a pastor's wife. I run charities. I am a pillar of this community. You cannot put me in handcuffs. I am wearing vintage silk." The agents did not hesitate. They hauled Corinne to her feet, ignoring her dramatic weeping, and slapped the cuffs onto her wrists. She wailed loudly, begging the surrounding church members to help her, but nobody moved. The elite donors and the wealthy politicians who had worshipped her just hours ago now looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. They backed away from her as if she were carrying a highly contagious disease. Ezekiel was dragged back into the main ballroom by the agent who had tackled him in the kitchen. His expensive tuxedo was torn and covered in dirt and kitchen grease. His face was actively bleeding from where Corinne had violently scratched him during their brawl. He looked like a wild, crazed vagrant, rather than a respected spiritual leader. When he saw Preston and Corinne standing in handcuffs, his mind finally snapped. The sheer reality of losing his wealth, his holy status, and his freedom drove him into a state of absolute delusional hysteria. He began thrashing wildly against the federal agents, screaming at the top of his lungs. "You cannot do this to me!" Ezekiel bellowed, spittle flying from his lips as he struggled uselessly against the cold steel binding his wrists. "I am a man of God. I built this city. I built this empire with my own two hands. You have no jurisdiction here. This country club is mine. This entire property belongs to my real estate firm. You cannot arrest me on my own property. I stood perfectly still, pouring myself another splash of champagne as I watched my father completely unravel. I raised the microphone to my lips one last time, looking directly into his manic, terrified eyes. About that, Ezekiel, I said, my voice soft, but carrying the weight of an absolute, undeniable reckoning. I do not think you are in a position to claim ownership over this country club or anything else in this city. You see, you have been so entirely focused on Preston and his fraudulent hedge fund that you completely ignored the larger financial currents moving right beneath your feet. You thought you were the smartest man in the room, but you never once stopped to consider who was actually funding the loans that kept your precious real estate empire afloat. Before Ezekiel could even begin to process the implication of my words, the heavy oak doors at the far end of the ballroom swung open with a massive, resounding thud. The sound was so violent and unexpected that the federal agents instinctively reached for their sidearms, and the remaining high society guests let out a collective gasp of terror. The flashing red and blue lights from the police cruisers outside poured through the open doorway, casting long, dramatic shadows across the sticky marble floor. A man stepped through the threshold. He did not look like the dangerous criminal Ezekiel had described to Kiera all those years ago. He did not look like a thug or a low-level street enforcer. He was wearing a charcoal gray bespoke Tom Ford suit that fit his broad shoulders with immaculate precision. His silver hair was perfectly styled, and his posture radiated a terrifying, effortless authority that made every single person in the room instantly hold their breath. He walked with the slow, measured gait of a man who owned the entire world and knew exactly how to dismantle it piece by piece. He was flanked by 4 massive men in dark suits who moved with the silent, lethal coordination of elite private security. They fanned out behind him, securing the entrance and watching the room with cold, calculating eyes. The federal agents, who had been so aggressive just moments ago, immediately stepped back, parting like the Red Sea to let the man pass. They recognized absolute power when they saw it. The mayor of Atlanta, who had been cowering near the overturned catering tables, let out a loud, audible gasp. His face drained of all remaining color, and he physically stumbled backward, knocking over a broken chair. He recognized the man instantly. Everyone in the elite tiers of the global financial world knew the face of Jeremiah Vance. He was not just a wealthy investor. He was an elusive phantom, a billionaire magnate who controlled international shipping lines, vast real estate portfolios, and private equity firms across 3 different continents. He was a man who toppled governments and bankrupted rival corporations before breakfast, and he was walking directly toward my handcuffed father. Ezekiel stared at the man approaching him, and the last shred of his sanity completely evaporated. His eyes bulged in their sockets, and his jaw dropped open in pure, unadulterated horror. He recognized the face. He recognized the cold, calculating eyes of the man he had sold his 15-year-old daughter to in a filthy, abandoned cabin 17 years ago. Ezekiel tried to scramble backward, but the federal agent kept a firm grip on his torn tuxedo collar, forcing him to stay on his knees. "You," Ezekiel choked out, his voice nothing more than a ragged, terrified whisper. "It cannot be you. You are a criminal. You are a monster. I made a deal with you. I left her with you." Jeremiah did not look angry. He looked entirely serene, which made him infinitely more terrifying. He walked smoothly past the weeping Corinne and the completely paralyzed Preston, stopping right next to me. He stood tall and commanding, a perfect anchor in the center of the chaotic ballroom. He reached out and gently placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder, a gesture of pure paternal protection that made Ezekiel flinch as if he had been physically struck. "You always were a remarkably stupid man, Ezekiel," Jeremiah said, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that echoed effortlessly through the silent ballroom. "You let your greed and your pathetic desperation blind you to the absolute reality of the world. 17 years ago, you drove a terrified 15-year-old girl out to a cabin in the middle of nowhere. You sold your own flesh and blood to a man you believed was a violent cartel leader. You handed her over to me like she was nothing but a piece of trash to settle your filthy gambling debts and to fund your fake holy empire." The congregation gasped in collective horror. The wealthy donors and church elders stared at Ezekiel with absolute revulsion, finally understanding the true depth of their pastor's depravity. Corinne, who was still sitting in handcuffs on the floor, let out a low, agonizing moan, realizing that her perfect high society life was not just over. It was about to become the subject of federal investigations and true crime documentaries. But you did not know who I really was. Jeremiah continued, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the kneeling pastor. You did not know that I had been tracking your corrupt little real estate firm for months. You thought you were so clever hiding behind your church and your phony charity, but you made one massive, unforgivable mistake. Jeremiah turned to look at me, and I reached into the neckline of my dress, pulling out the heavy antique silver locket I had worn every single day since I was a child. I held it up, letting the crystal chandeliers catch the tarnished metal. You did not know that the locket she wore belonged to my little sister, Jeremiah, said his voice dropping an octave, wrapping around the room like a physical threat. My sister, who died because your corrupt shell companies bought up her medical debt and foreclosed on the hospital that was treating her. I did not arrange that meeting in the cabin because I wanted a victim, Ezekiel. I arranged that meeting because I wanted to look the monster who destroyed my family directly in the eyes. I wanted to see the pathetic little coward who built his kingdom on the blood of innocent people. Ezekiel began to shake violently, crying and blubbering, denying everything, pleading with the federal agents to protect him from the billionaire standing over him. But the agents did not move. They simply watched the absolute destruction of a man who had built a legacy on lies. I did not hurt Vivica, Jeremiah said, turning his gaze back to the crowd, ensuring that every single camera phone captured the truth. I looked at this brilliant broken girl and I saw the exact same fire, the exact same relentless spirit that my sister had. I did not lock her away in a dark room. I took her in. I raised her. I gave her the finest education money could buy. I sent her to the best universities in the world. I taught her everything I knew about corporate strategy, hostile takeovers, and ruthless financial domination. I trained her to be the apex predator of the global financial world. I turned the very child you discarded into the absolute architect of your total destruction. Kiera, who was still huddled near the broken catering table, clutching her pregnant belly, let out a loud, hysterical sob. Her entire identity had been built on being the golden child, the chosen daughter, the one who got the country club wedding and the wealthy investment broker husband. Now, she was staring at the sister she had mocked and abused, realizing that I was not just successful. I was the heir to a billionaire empire. I was untouchable. And she was nothing but the pregnant unwed mistress of a federal criminal. Preston struggled against his handcuffs, glaring at Jeremiah with toxic disbelief. "This is insane," Preston shouted, spittle flying from his mouth. "You cannot just come in here and claim you own everything. I am an investment banker. I know how the laws work. You cannot just take over our assets because you have money. We have legal rights. We have property deeds." Jeremiah turned his cold gaze toward Preston, and a slow, chilling smile spread across his face. He reached inside the breast pocket of his bespoke suit and pulled out a thick stack of heavy legal documents bound in red leather. He did not hand them to Preston. He held them up for the entire ballroom to see. "You really should have paid more attention to who was buying up your toxic debt," Preston Jeremiah said smoothly. "When your hedge funds started collapsing, you desperately sought private equity loans to cover your tracks. You thought you found a generous offshore investor willing to bail you out, but you were actually signing over the master deeds to every single asset you and your fraudulent father-in-law ever touched." Jeremiah stepped forward and dropped the heavy stack of documents directly onto the marble floor, right in front of Ezekiel's bleeding face. "Today, my niece and I legally purchased the majority debt on your failing hedge fund," Jeremiah announced, his voice booming with finality. "We bought the debt on Genesis Holdings. We bought the debt on your ridiculous suburban mansion. And most importantly, we bought the master deed to this very country club. You do not own a single brick of this building, Ezekiel. You are trespassing on our private property." The silence that followed was absolute. The sheer magnitude of the takeover paralyzed every single person in the room. There was no loophole left to exploit. There was no defense attorney who could argue their way out of this. Ezekiel, Corinne, and Preston were entirely surrounded by federal agents bound in steel handcuffs and completely stripped of every single dime they had ever stolen. "Take them off my property," I said, looking directly at the lead FBI agent. "The stench of their failure is ruining my champagne." The agents hauled Ezekiel, Corinne, and Preston to their feet, roughly pushing them toward the exit. Ezekiel was sobbing loudly, begging for forgiveness, begging for a second chance, pleading with God to save him. Corinne was screaming at the photographers, demanding they stop filming her ruined dress and her smeared makeup. Preston was completely silent, his eyes wide and vacant, finally shattered by the realization that he was going to spend the best years of his life in a federal cell. Kiera tried to follow them, crying out for her mother, but a federal agent held up a hand, stopping her in her tracks. She collapsed against the wall, sliding down until she was sitting on the floor alone, disgraced and utterly ruined. The Golden family of Atlanta was gone, completely erased from the elite society they had ruled with such cruel arrogance. Jeremiah turned to me, his eyes shining with profound pride. He offered me his arm, and I took it, linking my hand through his. We did not look back as we walked gracefully out of the ballroom, stepping over the shattered glass and the ruined remnants of the gala. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated our path as we walked out into the cool night air, leaving the ashes of my past far behind us. The reckoning was complete. The ultimate payoff had been delivered, and I had finally claimed the brilliant, untouchable future I was always meant to have. The heavy steel doors of the country club stood wide open as the federal agents hauled my parents through the crowd. Ezekiel was no longer the powerful, commanding pastor of the largest megachurch in Atlanta. He was just a broken, terrified old man stumbling over his own feet. His expensive tuxedo was torn and stained with spilled wine, and his face was bleeding from where Corinne had clawed him. He kept looking back over his shoulder, his eyes wide and pleading, begging the wealthy donors and the city councilmen to intervene. He cried out to the mayor, telling him they were brothers and that he needed help. The mayor simply turned his back and walked away. Every single person in that elite congregation watched in absolute disgusted silence as their spiritual leader was paraded out like a common thief. Corinne was dragged right behind him. The pristine, polished image she had cultivated for 30 years was entirely, completely destroyed. Her designer gown was ripped and soaked in expensive champagne. Her perfect hair was a tangled, messy knot, and her mascara ran down her cheeks in thick, dark lines. She was weeping hysterically, but nobody offered her a tissue or a word of comfort. The high society women who used to hang on her every word now held up their smartphones, recording her ultimate public humiliation. They captured every pathetic sob and every desperate plea as the federal agents pushed her out the front doors and into the flashing red and blue lights of the waiting police cruisers. The heavy doors slammed shut behind them, severing my parents from polite society forever. Preston was the last to go. The charismatic Wall Street broker who thought he could outsmart the federal government and steal millions of dollars was completely paralyzed by the reality of his own ruin. The agents practically had to carry him because his legs simply stopped working. He stared blankly at the floor, his mind entirely shattered by the sheer magnitude of the trap he had walked into. He knew his secret life in Connecticut was over. He knew his fraudulent hedge fund was dismantled. He knew he was going to spend decades in a federal prison cell. He did not look at me, and he certainly did not look at Kiera. He just let the agents drag him away into the cold, dark night. The ballroom suddenly felt incredibly vast and hollow. The music had stopped long ago, and the only sound left was the quiet murmuring of the remaining guests as they hastily gathered their coats and moved toward the exits. They wanted to get as far away from the wreckage of the Williams family as possible. Within minutes, the massive, opulent room was nearly empty, leaving behind only overturned chairs, shattered crystal glasses, and the undeniable stench of a ruined empire. And right in the middle of all that destruction sat Kiera. My younger sister was huddled on the sticky marble floor, clutching her pregnant belly with trembling hands. Her diamond heels were kicked off and tossed carelessly near a broken catering tray. She was sobbing so hard that her entire body shook violently. The golden child, the undisputed princess of our family, had lost absolutely everything in less than an hour. Her wealthy, handsome husband was a federal criminal with a secret family. Her massive bank accounts were frozen. Her parents were sitting in the back of a police car. Her pristine social status was completely eradicated. She was entirely alone. I walked slowly across the room, my heels clicking softly against the marble. I stepped over a torn piece of floral arrangement and stopped right in front of her. Kiara slowly lifted her head. Her face was red and blotchy, her eyes swollen from crying. She looked up at me, and for the first time in her entire life, there was no arrogance, no superiority, and no mocking sneer. There was only pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at the sister she had bullied and tormented for years, and she finally realized that I held her entire future in the palm of my hand. "You took everything," she whispered, her voice cracking and raw. "You took my husband and my money and my family. What am I supposed to do now, Vivica? Where am I supposed to go? I have a baby coming. I have nothing left." I looked down at her, and I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I did not feel sadness or anger. I just felt a deep, profound emptiness when I looked at the girl who had happily watched my mother throw me out of the house like a piece of trash. "You did this to yourself, Kiara," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady in the quiet ballroom. "You built your entire life on a foundation of lies and stolen money. You let your greed and your pathetic need for status blind you to the monster you married. You actively participated in every single cruelty this family inflicted on me because it made you feel special. You thought you were untouchable because you were the favorite daughter. But the real world does not care about your country club memberships or your designer bags." Kiara let out another wounded sob, burying her face in her hands. "Please," she begged, her voice muffled and pathetic. "Please, Vivica, I have no money. The accounts are completely frozen. I cannot even buy a hotel room for the night. You cannot just leave me here on the floor." I stared at her shaking shoulders. I thought about that cold, terrifying night 15 years ago. I thought about standing in the massive international terminal, surrounded by thousands of strangers clutching a useless $200 bill, while my mother walked away without looking back. I remembered the sheer, suffocating panic of realizing I was completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect me. I reached into my designer clutch and pulled out a small, sleek keycard. I tossed it onto the marble floor right next to her trembling hands. It landed with a soft plastic clatter. "I am not going to leave you with $200 at an airport like they did to me," I said, looking down at her tear-stained face. "I am not a monster, Kiara. I am not going to let you sleep on the street while you are pregnant. That keycard is for a corporate apartment downtown. It is paid for the next 30 days. The refrigerator is stocked, and the utilities are covered. It is a clean, safe place for you to figure out what you are going to do next." Kiara stared at the keycard as if it were a mirage. She slowly reached out her shaking fingers, brushing against the plastic. She looked back up at me, her eyes wide with confused, desperate gratitude. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you, Vivica. I promise I will pay you back." I held up a hand, stopping her pathetic apologies. "Do not thank me," I said, my tone dropping to a cold, absolute freeze. "That apartment is the absolute limit of my generosity, and it comes with a strict condition. You have exactly 24 hours to clear all of your personal belongings out of my property. You will pack your clothes, and you will vacate the estate by tomorrow evening. If you try to take any art, any furniture, or anything purchased with stolen funds, my private security team will have you arrested for trespassing and theft. Do you understand me, Kiara?" She nodded frantically, clutching the keycard to her chest. "I understand," she sobbed. "I will be gone. I promise I will be gone." "Good," I said, turning away from her. "Now get off my floor." Kiara scrambled to her feet, grabbing her discarded heels. She did not say another word. She just kept her head down and practically ran toward the heavy oak doors, fleeing the ballroom and disappearing into the cold night. She was finally gone, and the last toxic remnant of my past was completely erased. The grand ballroom was entirely empty now. The federal agents had finished their sweep, and the local police had cleared the perimeter. The chaotic, terrible energy that had suffocated me all evening had completely evaporated. The oppressive fake atmosphere of the Atlanta elite was entirely gone, leaving behind a massive quiet space that felt incredibly peaceful. I stood alone in the center of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of the gala. I reached up and gently touched the heavy antique silver locket resting against my collarbone. The cool metal felt grounding, a solid reminder of everything I had survived and everything I had built. I closed my eyes for a brief second, letting the profound silence wash over me. The war was over. The battle I had been fighting since I was a terrified 15-year-old girl was finally officially won. A slow, steady footstep echoed across the marble floor. I opened my eyes and turned around. Jeremiah was walking toward me, his hands casually tucked into the pockets of his bespoke suit. His private security team had waited outside, giving us the entire ballroom to ourselves. He stopped a few feet away, looking at the overturned tables, the spilled champagne, and the scattered floral arrangements. He did not look angry or upset about the mess. He looked incredibly satisfied. "You handled that perfectly," he said, his deep baritone voice breaking the heavy silence. "You dismantled their entire operation with absolute surgical precision. You did not let emotion cloud your judgment, and you executed the takeover flawlessly. I could not be more proud of you, Vivica." I smiled, feeling a genuine warmth spread through my chest. Coming from the most feared and respected billionaire in the financial world, that compliment meant everything. "I learned from the absolute best," I replied, dropping my hands to my sides. "You taught me how to read the numbers, how to track the offshore accounts, and how to wait patiently for the exact right moment to strike. I just followed your playbook." Jeremiah chuckled, a low, rich sound that echoed in the empty room. "You went far beyond my playbook, kid. You took everything they built and you turned it to ash in a single evening. You ripped their empire right out from under their feet, and you did it all completely within the bounds of the law. They never even saw you coming." He walked closer, stepping over a broken crystal glass. He looked around the massive vaulted ceilings, the grand chandeliers, and the opulent architectural details of the country club. "It really is a beautiful property," he observed, his eyes scanning the intricate molding. "A bit flashy for my taste, but structurally very sound. It will make an excellent addition to our commercial portfolio once we gut the interior and rebrand the entire operation." I reached into my clutch one last time. My fingers brushed past my phone, and my credit cards wrapping around a heavy set of brass keys attached to a thick leather keychain. I pulled them out, holding them up in the dim light of the ballroom. The keys clinked softly against each other, a sharp metallic sound that signaled the ultimate transfer of power. Jeremiah looked at the keys, and then he looked at me. His eyes were soft, reflecting the deep paternal bond we had built over the last 17 years. He had taken in a broken, discarded child, and he had raised a conqueror. He had given me the tools to exact my revenge, and he had stood by my side while I executed it. "Ready to go home, kid?" Jeremiah asked, a gentle smile touching the corners of his mouth. I looked at the heavy brass keys resting in the palm of my hand. I thought about the massive suburban estate sitting empty across town. I thought about this sprawling, luxurious country club. I thought about the millions of dollars in recovered assets that were now legally secured under my corporate holding company. I looked around the silent, ruined ballroom one last time, absorbing the sheer magnitude of my absolute victory. The people who had tried to destroy me were locked in federal holding cells. The sister who had mocked me was sleeping in a temporary corporate apartment. The empire they had built to keep me out was now entirely mine. I looked back at Jeremiah, wrapping my fingers tightly around the cold brass keys. I smiled, and it was the most genuine, unburdened smile I had ever felt. "I am home," I said, my voice ringing with total absolute certainty. "And I own it."